Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is my honor to welcome you to Professor Daryai's lecture, The Muslim Conquest of Iranshahr and Its Aftermath, brought to you by ISA. My name is Niku, and I'm ISA's Communication Director. As members of Iranian Student Alliance in America, we wish to increase the general public's awareness regarding Iran and the historical, political, and social issues affecting the Iranian community, and to promote the Iranian American identity and culture. We want to encourage Iranians' representation and involvement in the American political arena, and ultimately provide a forum to address and discuss issues concerning the greater Iranian community. Dr. Turaj Daryai was born in Tehran in 1967. After a series of travels from the young age of 4 and attending various institutions both in Europe and the United States, he attended University of California, Los Angeles, where he received his PhD in history in 1997. It is also our pleasure to have Professor David Stronach with us tonight. David Stronach has been Professor of Near Eastern Archaeology at the University of California at Berkeley until he retired in 2004. He has excavated at Pasargadae, the capital of Cyrus the Great. He is undoubtedly one of the world's top experts on Pasargadae. The breadth and distinction of his scholarship have earned him many honors and awards. Please join me in welcoming Professor Stronach, who will introduce Dr. Daryai and talk about his scholarly contributions to Iranian culture.
Good evening. I will just add a few words to Nico's remarks. The details of Professor Turaj Daryai's curriculum vitae are decidedly impressive. Following an initial appointment at California State Fullerton, he was appointed in 2007 as the Howard C. Baskerville Professor in the History of Iran and the Persianate World, and the Associate Director of the Dr. Samuel M. Jordan Center for Persian Studies and Culture at the University of California at Irvine. Dr. Daryai is a prolific author, and apart from being the editor of the Namiye Irani Bastan, also known as the International Journal of Ancient Iranian Studies, he's the author of many books and articles. Indeed, his most recent book, Sasanian Persia, The Rise and Fall of an Empire, received the 2011 award of the British Society for Middle Eastern Studies. But above all else, I wish to underscore Professor Daryai's versatility and his integrity. He has mastered all the necessary tools for his wide-ranging research. That is to say that he is an accomplished linguist, historian, and numismatist. He has a keen eye for social interactions, for the value of the history of food, for example, and for the difficult nuances of religious interaction, whether between Zoroastrianism and Christianity or between Zoroastrianism and the Muslim faith. Also, not being content with studying the Sasanian Empire in all its complexity, with, I might say, an incisive and clear writing style, he's taken up the challenge of understanding the history of Iran at the moment of transition from the end of Sasanian times into the beginning of the Islamic period. I want, for those of you here who are interested in early Iran, to have a sense, in fact, of all the many tools you need in order to acquire an appropriate breadth of knowledge in this subject. And I will close by saying that we are very privileged indeed to hear Turaj Daryai on his present extremely important topic. Professor Daryai.
Should I be holding this? Because there's, or I could just hang it like a noose around my. How about this?
Fashionable.
Fashionable? Great. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Stronach, thank you very much for that very kind, too kind of an introduction. I wish half of those things that he said were true. I try my best. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank ISA, what in Persian is called همبستگی دانشجویان ایرانی در Berkeley, Iranian Student Association of Berkeley, for the kind invitation, as well as the Near Eastern Studies Department, where we have the distinguished professors, Professor Stronach here, Professor Azarpay, and Professor Schwartz here before us, and also Professor Vivina, who has come from Stanford, who is my dear friend. If you cannot hear me, I suggest you come a little bit forward, and then I think you will get a better sense of what is going on. Now, the topic I've chosen today is something that is, I don't want to say dear, but very important to many Iranians. In fact, I like to invoke or paraphrase something that William Faulkner has said, and so much has been repeated even by President Obama and others, this quote, that the past is not dead. In fact, it's not even past. In fact, the Arab-Muslim conquest for many Iranians is as if it took place just yesterday. It's somehow imbued in our psyche, the way we look at the world, the way we judge the nation state of Iran, but perhaps what I call Iranshahr, from Oxus to Euphrates world, how it's turned out to be, and why perhaps hasn't done the way we imagine it should have. And we also have in retrospect, think how things should have been or was in antiquity, and then what happened as a result of the Arab-Muslim conquest. Now, I can't really say much more than the allotted time I have here for 45 minutes or 50 minutes about all of these matters. But what I will do, actually talk about today is, according to my view, of course, sort of a non-judgmental view of what seems to have happened between, let's say, the beginning of the 7th century, 628, let's say, with the death of the last great Sasanian king of kings, Shahanshah, Khosrow Parviz, who struck these gold coins, if we agreed that these are indeed his coinage as opposed to Khosrow I. I will begin from 628 and then try to go all the way to the 8th century. That is for about a century and a half, to see what is going on in some parts of Iran, so that doesn't mean that this is going on everywhere, and try to perhaps come to some sense of conclusion as how the Iranians reacted, interacted to this great Muslim sweep that defeated not only the Sasanian Empire, but the Chinese, the Turks, the Byzantines, virtually everyone that they fought against. Okay, that is what I will be talking about. So after the defeat of Khosrow Parviz, which has its own long history, which I'm not going to talk about, I traditionally divide the end of Sasanian history into 3 major periods. The first one is the period of fratricide and the waning of monarchic legitimacy. That's what I call it, at least. This is a phase of, indeed, disintegration, in the sense that Khosrow's son, Kavad II, comes to the throne. And he is going to eliminate his 17 or 18 brothers, that is, have them killed. In this way, you have most of the legitimate heirs to the Sasanian throne being actually eradicated. That in itself is a great blow to this Sasanian empire. One of my students is working now on environmental history and plague. He is now writing on the plague of Shiruye. In fact, during the reign of Kavad, a plague seems to have taken place in Mesopotamia and southwestern Iran that had a devastating effect. We rarely think of natural causes, the issue of irrigation, its upkeep, as well as plague, and the effect that it has on the economy and actually the politics, and that's what he's doing. And the plague seems to have been also very important, which, according to some accounts, led to the death of Kavad II. And then his son Ardashir III, who is quite a young boy when he's put on the throne, where the first real coup or takeover of power by a non-member of the Sasanian family takes place. The famous Sasanian general, Shahbaraz, who had done wonders for the Sasanian military in the 7th century, in fact, attempts and is successful at taking the throne. Here's a piece of evidence that we have from Sebios, an important historian, Armenian historian, which tells us that Heraclius, the Byzantine emperor, actually tells Shahbaraz to indeed take the throne. And this is, I think, unprecedented, certainly in Sasanian history. That is, if we look at Sasanian ideology, the idea of the person from the family of Sasan is endowed with what we call khware or far, as many of you know in Persian, the special ingredient that brings legitimacy to the Iranian world, to the king, and where it's manifested in various ways, including this halo, as you see it around the king's head, is very important. And it stated, according to Sasanian ideology and in the Persian text, it stays with the rightful king, and of course the Sasanian king, who is ruling over this territory called Iranshahr. And the Shah, of course, is endowed with it. For the first time now, we have a general who thinks that there is no need to be from the family of Sasan, and in fact, he could be endowed with the Khwara as well. This is a great breaking with the tradition. So not only you have now plague and defeat, but also the takeover of power by a non-Sasanian family. That is the first period of, I think, this beginning of decline of the Sasanian Empire. The second period, which I call factionalism and division, brings about a number of rulers, some of whom we do have literary evidence about. So early Islamic sources, Tabari, Tha'alabi, and the Persian sources, Bal-Amin, Farsnami, Ibn Balkhi, you name it, they do mention it, and there are a few that are missing, which we only have numismatic evidence. That is evidence from the coinage, including Khosrow III and the fourth, probably, and the Piruz. So we know a series of kings are mentioned: Queen Buran, Azar Midokht, Khosrow III, and Khosrow IV, and a Piruz. In between 630 and 632, which is a bit odd. For about 2 or 3 years, you have about 5 or 6 kings and queens minting coins. Apparently they're ruling. How is this possible? Is it that they are ruling one after another? That is the traditional suggestion that is given. Now, according to my idea, that is not the case. In fact, what has happened is that the empire has fractured, where there are locations or provinces that a certain pretender to the throne is minting coins, and then you have others in Iraq or Mesopotamia and in Fars and the close areas who are the crowned king or queen minting coins as well. That is, depending on the locality, different people are claiming kingship. And many of these are generals who are doing this. The most important of these rulers of this period is Queen Buran. And Queen Buran is important not because this is a woman who's come to the throne. What is important is that she is the last ruler to try to restore order to this kingship. Every single source, and it's meager, that talks about Queen Buran states that not only she tried to make peace with the Byzantines and return the true cross, what was taken by Khosrow, but also to restore order within the empire, and also restore the ideological breakage that had taken place with Shahbaraz. For example, we have this beautiful, the traditional silver coinage of Sasanians, and we know this is Buran, her name there, the earrings and the braided hair. But then she also minted a gold coin. This is a medallion, special medallion, which states Buran, restorer of the lineage of the gods, which I suggest that is reverting to, or mentioning his father, Khosrow. He's saying that he's restoring the tradition of Sasan. So there's ideological implications, but also practical implications with Buran. Buran is eliminated, and while she's there or eliminated, we have these other strange coinage of a Khosrow, and there are 2 sets. A Khosrow III, who probably is in Fars, and a Khosrow IV, who is in Khuzestan. So these, you might say generals, perhaps warlords, are minting coins suddenly in their own name. They may be the family of Sasan, or more probably that they are simply generals who have power, military power. Now, my colleague and friend Parwaneh Khoshriyati has written a very exciting book called The Decline and the Fall of the Sasanian Empire. I think it's a book about 500 pages long. trying to suggest that indeed the reason that the Sasanian Empire fell was because the house of Parthians, or the Arsacids, Farrukhzad and Rustam Farrukhzad, the general, the famous general who fought at the Battle of Qadisiyah against the Arabs, were from the family of Arsacids. And at the very moment that the Sasanians needed help to fight the Arabs, they actually pulled, you might say, the rug under them, and resulted in the collapse of the Sasanians. This is a tantalizing, I think, hypothesis, and very interesting in this suggestion. And we know that Azamidokht is killed indeed by one of these generals. I think the important point is there is another general here attempting to take over the throne, regardless of the family association. The third stage of this Sasanian fall is the period of Yazgir, the third, which I call the wandering kingship, where the king really does not have any power, moving from province to province, trying to gain support. The numismatic sources, the coinage, beautifully demonstrate his movement. His early years coinages, he rules for 20 years. The early years, we have his coinage from Fars, from Mesopotamia, from western Iranshahr. As he moves east, those coinage, they stop being produced, and then central Iran starts minting coins. And then finally in the east, Kerman, Niyaz, and then Khorasan, or Greater Khorasan. That exactly shows where his power is. Whenever he was in this location, coins were minted in his name. And then it stopped. That suggests also to us that he doesn't really have that much of a support base. Now, there are other interesting and tantalizing ideas about Yazgir as well, about his character, his religious preoccupation. An Italian sinologist, Antonio Forte, about 10 or 15 years ago, wrote several interesting articles about Yazgir and his family, who apparently we thought had paid for the building of Zoroastrian temples in China. Forte has suggested that indeed these were Christian temples and not Zoroastrian ones, which is kind of interesting. But not to, again, for me to judge what it is, but we know if you read the Shahnamat, it's a popular tradition, based probably on the Khodai version, that the people who find Yazgir's body after the miller has killed him are Christians, who give him a proper burial. So there is something about Christianity that seems to be lurking here vis-a-vis the family of Sasan. And I should just also mention that we know that in the late Sasanian period, there is gravitation by a certain group, certain family members of the Sasanians and the nobility towards Christianity. And Christianity is quite popular. Now, if that had a hand in his support or lack of support, is a hypothesis that needs to be proven. But all of this is taking place. So the conquest is much more conquest, at least what is going on internally, until we get to the Arab Muslim conquest. Okay? Are you okay? So, how did the conquest take place? After Yazgir is killed by a miller, as we're told, in 651 in Khorasan, at the order of Mahmud, we also come across the conquest. How? How did the Muslims conquer the Sasanian Empire? This is one of these questions that many people have tried to answer, and depending on your nationalist view, if you have a nationalist view, if you have your pro-Islamist view, your ideological view, if you're left, or you're secular, you end up giving various reasoning and answers. In fact, there is, I think, a better study is to see what in the 20th century has been written about this event and sort of the ideological window of the authors than the event itself that took place in the 7th century. I was just mentioning to Professor Stronach, when I was growing up, reading in Persian mainly, since I didn't know any other language, most of the things I read about ancient Iran were through translations of Soviet bloc historians into Persian. This is who was part of the Iranian Communist Party and the Tudeh Party. Diakhanov, Petroshevsky, the most important book on Iran, Islam in Iran, Granotsky, Pargolevskaya, All of these were translated into Persian. And that's how we saw and we came to understand not only the Sassanians but their downfall as this class-based society where the Mobids are forcing the people under pressure, and the people are sick and tired and they're willing to open the doors to the Arab Muslims. If you've heard of this common story, this is a very much a nice leftist Soviet law historiography which was translated into Persian, and we took it, and Mazdak became this hero, right? This great revolutionary. This is how we've gotten this idea. If you look at the sources themselves, there's none of this that you see. There's nowhere that says, yes, these Iranians were opening the doors to the gates because they were under a class-based society, that they were thinking of Baradari and Baradari, brotherhood and equality. No, this is the writing of historians in the 20th century that has made a resonance with our mind. Especially if you were raised in Iran, that would be what would you have gotten at least. So when we come to the conquest, we do have a set of literature called the Futuh literature. And the Futuh literature are conquest texts, which discuss in somewhat of a general order as to the siege and the conquest, followed by the subjugation of the provinces and the territories, and then the Futuh in general. So if you look at Baladari and Baladari type literature, that is the typical thing that you'll get. There's a very good book written on this idea of Futuh literature, what you may really call, in Persian and in Arabic, you would call Rajaz. It's really a boasting type of a literature, where a group of people who don't have a great organization, as here we're talking about the Arab Muslims, are able to come and defeat this empire that has innumerable army, well organized, very nicely dressed and so on, where there are these people in ragtags and they have no real organization, but God willing, they're able to defeat these Persians who are opulent and arrogant. This is the Rajaz type of literature, of Baladari, the Futuh literature, that also has made a dent in our psyche, of course, but that's an earlier type of literature as to why the Muslims are able to defeat the Persians or the Sassanians. So here's another historiography that is interesting. And this in itself, this Futuh literature is also retrojecting into the past. They're not writing this in the 7th century when the conquest is taking place. This is written a century or two after the conquest. It's written as sort of to try to boast to the Muslim community, to the Ummah, as to what had happened 200 years ago, how they're able to become the dominant group, and the Zoroastrians and the Christians and everybody else are these subaltern sort of the minority religions under their power. Okay? So you must also be very careful when you look at Futuh literature. You just can't pick up a ladder and say, oh yeah, conquered. There are so many numbers of Iranians, and the Muslims are only 1/10 of them, but God willing, and a miracle happens and we defeat them. Okay, so that is the literary evidence that we have for the conquest, which is questionable. Now, what I tried to do when I was much younger, to try to look at the textual and the material evidence, the coinage and whatever we have in terms of material culture, next to each other, and try to perhaps guess how was this empire organized, at least in one province of it when I worked on it. How did it change as a result of this Muslim conquest? How are these similar and different in terms of reporting how the conquest took place and its result? Now, rather than talking about a 250-page dissertation, I'll just tell you in about 5 minutes, okay? Really what needs to be done. Well, we know that in terms of the conquest narrative, we know the conquest began from Bahrain, forces going to Fars, where the Caliph, Omar, says, has a famous saying in At-Tabari and others, who says, I wish there was between us and the people of Fars a mountain of fire through which they cannot reach us nor we them. It's interesting that, at least according to Tabari and some other authors, the Muslims weren't really interested beyond Mesopotamia and Fars. In fact, the general who takes or attempts to take Fars over on the behest of the Muslims is chastised by Omar. It seems that Iraq or Mesopotamia, Iraq was their center of interest, and they wanted that. Now, be it because of its, agricultural resource, its importance in various ways, and the population makeup, which had a large, of course, Iranian and Aramaic speaking, and Jewish and other groups there. That seems to have been the point of interest. to them. But it does happen that the conquest takes on because the Muslims, while early on are defeated in several battles, at the big battles they are successful. The most important battle is the Battle of Qadisiyah. That is something that probably every Iranian who has read history knows about and thinks about even today. As I said, invoking William Faulkner's term, the past hasn't passed. Qadisiyah just took place yesterday. Well, it not only took place for the Iranians yesterday, mind you, during the Iran-Iraq War, if you've seen some of the graffitis and writings during the time of Saddam Hussein, he also had, I remember a French author had produced these beautiful war propaganda drawings of the Iraqis that, you know, Rostam is being, the famous Sassanian general, Rostam Farrokh is being slashed by Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas and being killed. And on there it says, as we destroyed the Persians, you know, 1400 years ago, we are going to defeat them again. Now, the French author didn't know that this Rostam is not the famous sort of Pahlavan Rostam in the Shahnameh. He said, this is the great Shahnameh, person. In fact, Saddam Hussein probably was talking about, this Rostam. So this also gets played not only in the Iranian world, but also in the Arab world and during the time of the Iran-Iraq War. So this has high sort of ideological, I think, value for either side. The battle that really puts an end to the Sasanian Empire is the Battle of Nehavand in 642. We have the famous Iranshahr, who has a very interesting career, a general who fights in Khuzestan, who fights at Nehavand, who's taken prisoner, taken all the way to Mecca. He becomes Muslim. We're told that he actually gives some secrets on how to fight the Iranians. By the way, we should also mention that there were Iranian elite cavalry that did join the Muslims. So from Iraq and Khuzestan onwards, it wasn't only Arabs conquering the Sasanian Empire. There were Iranian elite cavalry who were also joined in to conquer the Sasanian Empire. You might say, how could these Iranians do this? Well, we're living in the post-19th century, 18th century nationalist days, okay? For us, that seems sort of strange. But if you think of group solidarity and their interest, you could switch side easily if you could keep your status and power and your wealth. That could happen. And Mohsen Zakeri has written a fabulous book on the Ayyarun and the Sasanian elite cavalry, which if anybody's interested, convincingly has shown this, I think, without a doubt. Now, this conquest, I'm not here to say that it was a jolly event. No conquest is jolly. In fact, what happens is Iranshahr is killed by the way, once Omar is killed by Omar's son. Rai, the city of Rai, we're told that accepts to pay jizya of 500,000 dirhams or taxes. Ardabil about 100,000, and it's at the time that Yazgir has gone to Kerman, Sistan and Marwan has been murdered. So as Yazgir is moving up to Khorasan, these provinces are accepting to pay jizya and whatnot. And I'll talk about the methods in which the Muslims and the Iranians dealt with each other during the Islamic conquest. There were various avenues of contact and decisions to be made. But we know, according to the historical sources, literary sources, for example, if you look at the province of Fars, which I know a little bit more, the city of Estaf was conquered between 648 and 649, 2 years before the death of Yazgir. The city of Gur, Firuzabad, 649, 650. Shiraz, 640, 641, much earlier. Daragir, 643, 644. So there are various dates given for the conquest. Now, I have problems with all of these dates. What does it mean that a city was conquered? Because we know several of these cities rose up. Every time it was conquered, there was slaughter. For example, Estaf is the most famous one. I forgot now who mentions that 40,000 nobility and just cavalry are killed from the city of Estaf. The blood sort of flows into the street, we are told. I think Estaf mentions that. In Fars, there are these round figures given, 100,000 that are killed. And so what I think we can see in the literary sources is not the numbers that are true, but there's constant revolt and resubduing of the cities. That is, a city either loses or agrees to pay their taxes to them. And then they install an Amir, the Muslims, and then the people revolt and kill that Amir. The Muslims come back again to squash the revolt, and then killing goes on. And this is going on all through the 7th century, between 640 to 670. For about 30 years, about 3 decades, this is going on. But especially when Yazgird is alive, and I think the century after that. Now, another evidence for us, beside the literary sources that sometimes may not be the best source, are the, as I said, the coinage, the numismatic sources. Not only the Sasanian ones, but what would be called the Arab Sasanian, especially the anonymous Arab Sasanian. So this is a Sasanian, this is an Arab Sasanian. What is the difference? Well, it has a legend of Bismillah here. Well, this one is a bit later than anonymous. Hajjaj ibn Yusuf's name is actually written in Arabic, but before this we have the name of the Amirs written in Pahlavi on these coins, which is again interesting. And the image of Khusro, the sacred fire altar, the king's fire altar, is still there. But this is an Arab Sasanian coinage. This is the coinage that the Muslims have. By tracing these coinage, we know what years the Arabs were controlling that city, and then you get actually a non-Arab Sasanian, a Sasanian one on top of that. That shows that people have revolted and are minting this other coinage. This way gives us a very interesting view of things. I have just to, again, as I told you, put this 200-page thing short together. If you look at the last years of Yazgird's coinage with that of the earliest Arab Sasanian coinage, and compare it with historians such as Tabari, Balkhi, and Baladari, three important sources for the dates that the cities of Ardashir Khore, Bishapur, Darabgird, Estakh, Be'azami Kobad, these are cities in Fars. As to when they were conquered, you come to some very interesting conclusions. And this is what the conclusions are. Dates given by the literary texts, Baladari, Tabari, Estakhri, Balami, and others, for the conquest of the following cities are always earlier than the anonymous Arab Sasanian coinage. So the coinage which I tend to trust more tend to say that these cities weren't conquered so quickly. And probably the first time the cities were conquered, that date was used in the literary sources. Although the literary sources also are not unison in their description. And that should tell us again that there were further revolts. Arab Sasanian coins begin with the first year after Yazgird's death. His rule was recognized till his death, at least in Fars, at least the initial part. There are discrepancies for the date of the conquest in the literary and the numismatic evidence, as I have just mentioned. So, does the Sasanian Empire come to an end with the death of Yazgird? That has been the traditional idea. Nowadays, there's been further work done that while Yazgird was murdered in 651 by an Iranian or Miller from Khorasan, Yazgird had sent his sons and daughter to the east, further all the way to China. Remember I told you about Antonio Forte and his studies on what Yazgird was willing to pay in China. And we're told that Piruz, one of the sons of Yazgird, goes to the Chinese emperor to ask for help. And indeed, he's given a force of Turco-Chinese army and is able to establish what is called the Second Persian Sasanian Kingdom in what we think is Zarang in Sistan. This is also corroborated by Tabari. Tabari also tells us. So it seems for a while that while with the death of Yazgird things were all lost, there is this last effort by the son of Yazgird, one of the two, to come back and indeed establish something based on operation from what we call now, of course, beyond a modern-day Iranian nation state, and what we call the Second Sasanian rule, Sistan. And this independence or rule begins in 658, about 7 years after Yazgird's death, all the way to 673. So still there are Sasanians in 673 claiming to be king of kings, legitimate kings, and they're there to take it back. So this idea that the Sasanian family were these weakling rulers who at the end just ran away is again another modern myth, really, again, due to modern historiography, the way things are written in Iran. In fact, we know Piruz was in Sistan, and by 673 we're told that he returns to China. And even by 675, he was attempting to take back the Sasanian Empire. I have written a short article about these very strange coinage of Yazgird, the third for year 20. We have hundreds of them from Sistan. And the question is, why these coinage? You know, he wasn't there that long. Why there's this large number of coinage with the name of Yazgir, and sometimes on the margin it has a slogan free. I have suggested that this, in fact, is the coinage minted by Piruz and his other son. And so there were two sons, none of them put their names. In fact, they still minted in the name of Yazgir, the last ruler that, at least for many, seemed to have been important. We know in China, Piruz was given the title of general as a grandee in the Chinese court. He seems to have built temples in Xinjiang and died in 679. In fact, now we do have a statue that is in China with an inscription that my sinologist friend has translated for me, and Forte, I think, has worked on it and done so as well, which says, Piruz, the king of Persia, the general of the right flank, and the Spahlet of Persia. So these Sasanians, at least family, was in China in the late 7th century. But that's not it. Piruz's son, Nasser, in 679, is not going to give up and actually fights the Arab Muslims for another 30 years. Until 709 CE, until the 8th century CE, the Sasanian family is trying to get back the Sasanian Empire, where, of course, they're unsuccessful and come back to become the general of the left flank. There are still more of the Sasanian family who are trying to come back. The other son of Yazgir is Bahram, who in the Chinese sources, according to Forte, is called Aluhan, who he has, of course, identified with the name Bahram. And he seems to have traveled to Byzantium, to the other side, trying to receive aid from the Byzantine Empire. So one son goes to the east, one son goes to the west, trying to gain help. Now, here there's a nice Pahlavi, if you want to call it, poem. Sometimes people call it a Persian poem with, Pahlavi script, called Abar Madan Bahram Barzavan, on the coming of Bahram, the miraculous power. It's a Middle Persian poem of the hope and desires of Zoroastrians that Bahram would come and destroy the mosque, raise the mosque, and establish fire temple. This was always connected to the savior in the Zoroastrian tradition. Now, I think at a conference, others, including Carlo Ceretti, has shown that this, in all probability, is, in fact, Bahram, the other son of Yazgir, who is being seen as the great savior, as he has gone to the west. In fact, in the Bundahishan, an important Zoroastrian encyclopedic source, it is mentioned that when the Romans arrive and organize the rule for a year, at that time from the district of Kabulistan, right, from the east, someone will come whose glory is from the family of the lords. They call him Bahram. So it may be, again, a reference in the Bundahishan also to this other son, rather than the savior that we see in the Zoroastrian tradition, and the two traditions perhaps coalesce together. Okay, that is what seems to have happened. Here is part of that text on the coming of Bahram, the miraculous Bahram. So when will he come and save Iranians, and see what the Arabs have done to this fragrant gardens of the Iranians that they have taken, so on, so on, so on. That's something that very much in the nationalist circles of Iranians regarding Arab conquest, if you want to get its ancient text, just go to this poem and you'll see exactly what these people are thinking of the Arab Muslims, probably in the 7th or 8th century. So this is the coinage, or the last great coinage of the Sasanian world, minted by Piruz and Bahram. Even Bahram's son, Khosrow, who in Chinese sources called Julo, or Julo. Johan knows Chinese quite good in it, so he would be correcting my pronunciation, but with apologies, is also mentioned to have asked the Turks to help retake Iranshahr, but is unable. To conclude, I would say the first part, well, no, more than the first part of my talk, so if you could just bear with me a little bit longer. The fall of the Sasanian Empire was due to internal dynastic fighting. That we know, and we look at the three periods that I suggested, right? Generals of the empire militarized the empire, in a sense tried to take over the empire. If you know your Roman history, that sounds like 3rd century Roman Empire. Or the 4th century, or the 3rd century, you should say. Barrack emperors. sounds very much like where generals are just, or armies are raising their own general as the emperor. Of course, the emperor sometimes lasts a couple of days and is assassinated. And then another general is raised. And that seems to be the case, for me, at least in the late Sasanian Empire in the 7th century. What is going on? So multiple rulers or generals ruling over the Sasanian Empire. And as I mentioned, the only way to explain how so many kings and queens minted coins in less than a decade is that they were ruling at the same time in various ways. Also, only after 650, it is only after then that the Arab Muslims were able to mint coins in Fars. That's the province I know a little more. And the numismatic evidence suggests this theory, but pushes the date back to 651 and 652, a year after. And I think there were ideological reasons why Yazgir III's coinage in Sistan were minted with the year 20, because of their two sons. Lastly, the Sasanian family still hoped to conquer Iranshahr in the 8th century, so things aren't finished by 650, and Arab Muslims were able nominally to get access to the cities. Okay? Arab-Iranian encounter. So let's look at practicalities. What happens when Arabs and Muslims and the Sasanians or the Iranians meet? Well, there are various scenarios. One, the Muslims give several options to the conquerors, or to the conqueror. Convert, become part of Islamic world. Or accept Muslim rule. You don't need to become a Muslim. You pay tribute, but keep freedom, practice your own religion. But you can't do this once you fight, mind you. Either you submit right away. You can't fight and lose and then say, okay, I'll pay my jizya. By then, you probably are taken into slavery, or your women and children, all sorts of nasty things come to you. It might be, again, like the Romans, what they did to the Carthaginians and sort of these imperial forms of terrorism, I would say. Or you could resist and fight, which ended in death, slavery, and paying even more for their release. That was even worse. And so these were the options that were put before the cities that were ruled by Ostandar or the Shahdars, or sometimes the Magi or the priests. So it depends if there was a Marzban, if there was a Magi or the Mulbet, that is a priest who was in charge, or a general protecting the province or the city, to decide to pay a poll tax, to pay tribute, or fight and die. And we have various versions of it, depending on the locality that we're looking. So the province of Fars doesn't look like province of Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan doesn't look like Khorasan. Khorasan doesn't look like Sistan. We cannot make general assumptions about the entire thing. Once every single province is studied, then one can actually bring together all of these studies I mentioned. Michael Morney has studied Iraq. I have studied Fars. Harban Pusharti has studied Khorasan. Again, many other provinces remain to be studied to see what happened during the Islamic transformation. Then you could make a better guess than what we usually do as sort of generalities. In the 7th century, we also find some very interesting copper coinage, which I call independent or dependent lords. This is, in fact, during the Umayyad period. In the Umayyad period, we really think that, Iran is part of this great Islamic empire. It's done, but in fact, things are not as simple as we see. We have coinage, and I'm going to spare you all of these people, but just give you the name of a couple of them: Azad, Mansur, Farrokhzad, and Dara, who made very interesting coinage. Rika Gizlen is the sort of the master of this period of studying these copper coins. And what we see are remnants of the Sasanian tradition, of course, in not very nicely done coinage. And they take place after the death of Ali, the 4th Caliph, in 661, where Muawiyah is attempting to control the caliphate. So there's general chaos. There's infighting between the Arab ruling elite. And at that time that there's this infighting going on, we find suddenly the emission of these copper. Okay, and that is interesting as to the localities and sort of the, you might call it, imperial order rule. That again reminds me something like the Persis coinage, if you know about the Persis coinage and the Parthians and perhaps, but you have people who are perhaps independent or dependent on the ruling elite and are allowed to mint coinage. So here's Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, the governor of Iraq and Iran, late 7th century, 8th century, who has the typical Sasanian coinage. But then we get this type of coinage. The drawing is better because these copper coiners are in such bad shapes. At least you get to see the shape of it. Look, the obverse is the image of a Khosrow type with a winged crown. Pahlavi, there's the name of Farrukhzad, and I think that is Khwara Afzud. Martin, is that correct, Professor Schwartz? On the side, I think that's Khwara Afzud. It still has Gadeh Afzud. And there's Farrukhzad, if I'm not mistaken. You get typical Sasanian iconography has a legend of the line. And this is between 693 and 698. Okay? Now, and look at the iconography. You don't have a fire altar anymore. You have what I would call a simor, perhaps. A simor, which is very interesting. Why has the fire altar changed to a simor after the fall of the Sassanians? Here we have a coinage of Farrukhzad, another one on the left-hand side, and you can see why it's not so easy to do that. Rather, the legend is good. I think what is happening here is that the local Iranian military or elite have come into an agreement with the Umayyads to create an Umayyad Iranian confederacy to sustain this empire of the Umayyads. That is, the Umayyads have agreed to deal with the Iranians. And this is so very different from the traditional, if I can use Shiite historiography of what has happened. Shiite nationalists. That is, your Shiite and nationalists, so you say that the Shiism was good, it was the Arabs who were the bad ones, right? But what here we see is the Umayyads are the ones who are actually cooperating with the Iranians, if my suggestion is correct. So why, perhaps this is a wrong term to use, that the coinage is being de-Zoroastrianized, because Simorgh is of course very important, but Simorgh lives on beyond its Zoroastrian identity in Persian literature and the Iranian tradition. I think perhaps something is changing, and the Simorgh is, you might say it's kosher, it's okay to put on the coinage as a symbol of Iranian identity, except not a fire temple or a fire altar. That is a no-no, okay? I'm just using this famous of Dogs, Birds, and Bats because my professor, Hans-Peter Schmidt, wrote a 120-page article on Simorgh in 1980, which I had to read. Well, no, I didn't have to. I loved it. With Farrukhzad, just to mention one of these people, as again, minted coins not only independently, but has the name of these governors. Muhallab ibn Abi Sofra, in Tartus, in Ardashir Khore, and with Hajjaj ibn Yusuf in Bishapur. So these governors and Farrukhzad are minting coins together. This is fascinating stuff. And that tells me that they have come into this cooperation. Here's a coinage of Muhallab ibn Abi Sofra. Very much Iranian. Very much an Iranian coinage. Looks a bit, crooked coin on the iconography, but in Ardashir Khore, Bishapur, and Saq, we find these very interesting coinage of the two, perhaps. This is a Khosrow type coinage, of course, if you know Khosrow II special type coinage. Dara is another one of these fascinating people who has the legend Azad Bishapur, which I suggest that says Bishapur has become free. And has the, again, legend increasing glory. And here you have a ram shown on the back of the coinage. What does that signify? Well, Professor Azarpeh knows best here, and all the Iranologists, but it's a symbol of Khwara or glory. And that is one of its manifestations. If you take in Pahlavi, the first text you read is Karname Ardashir Babakon, you know that the ram was chasing the horse of Ardashir, and that showed that, of course, glory was following. So what we could conclude is that the Arab-Muslim conquest really did not end the resistance in Fars. What happened is that the Umayyads appealed to the local lords by making co-regency possible, with a period of what I call Perso-Arab cooperation emerging between 680 and 705 until the 8th century. And just to give you this last time, Umayyad claim is very interesting. One of the Umayyad's rulers, and this is not the coinage of Yazid III, but of course the name Yazid evokes all sorts of ideas and some of our thoughts. Yazid III, in fact, is said to have been the son of Walid and a noble Iranian or Sassanian woman, and in his genealogy claims that I am the son of Khosrow, my ancestor was Marwan. So we're already seeing this Irano or Perso-Arab sort of cooperation and becoming one, and in terms of ideology of rulership. And it's with the Umayyads. It's the one that we farthest think that would have or be amiable to this Iranian group. So with that, I'd like to end. I'm open for questions, if there's any. Go ahead.
I don't know anything about the coins, but I think about the language. And, it seems like, you're right, they went and took Babylonia, and over there the language they speak is Arabic, and then further past them the language is more Persian. So, can you tell us anything about that?
Sure. This language diversity is an important issue in pre-modern times. We should remember the idea of a national language is a modern phenomenon. This is a modern phenomenon. Not everyone spoke Persian. I would contend actually what the Sasanians do, by the end of the Sasanians, they've actually Persianized the region all the way to the Oxus, where Persian becomes this language and part of this identity of what I call Iranshahr, which is so very important. With an epic behind it, an idea of Iranian, there's mores and values that is going all over the place. But we should remember they're Aramaic speaking, not Arabic speaking, perhaps understandable to some extent. There are Jews living there, right? There are all sorts of people living with so many different languages, okay, and they're interacting with each other. And we hear of certain language differences within the provinces as well, and so there's variety. Now, Pahlavi was the language of the court and the language of communication, so it has some resonance more than others. You might think of Persian today as having played the same role. If you don't have Persian as a national language or a language that is language of the court or the system, no one is able to really interact with each other. It would be chaos. Okay, that is what's going on, I think, in general, in terms of the language. Sir.
So you mentioned that sons of Yazid tried to fight back or rule for 60 years, all the way up to 8
century 705.
And also the fact that you said Umayyads and Iranians were actually working together. So what prevented the Yazidi sons to take it?
Sure. You should remember that these local warlords don't have similar interests as the sons of Yazgir, perhaps. We should remember that is an imperial mentality. The king or the son of the king, the prince, the crown princes want to take the country back. That doesn't mean the military men, those who have local power, want the same thing. They want autonomy, they want to have their own power regardless of who's in charge. So, you could have different interests and fight at the same time and cooperate.
So the fact that there was a dynastic conflict, that could explain the fact that all those guns, as I guess Dr. Khoshayyati was suggesting that maybe the 7
houses, yeah.
Houses didn't support this.
That is Dr. Khoshayyati's contention, which is, I think, quite interesting and I would say tantalizing. I personally don't agree with it, although I think it's a great book. It really opens up so many questions. It's fantastic. And her main thesis is the House of the Arsacids, Parthians, are really responsible for this downfall. I think she's giving too much importance to the Parthians as a sort of one of the reasons. I think these are warlords in farce. They're not from the House of, Arsacids. So I think it's locality and interest. It's local interest, sort of group interest. Sir.
This Simon was really interesting. I know the importance of it from the Iranian side, but do you think it was chosen by the Arabs as well because of their nomadic background?
No. I think Farrokhzad is choosing this symbol. It's an Iranian idea, and it's an Iranian idea that I think is to a lesser extent perhaps at conflict with Arab Muslim mores and values. That is, by the end of 7th century, fire altars are not the regular reverse symbol that you want to have. Okay, that's not what you. But a Seymour, which to an Arab Muslim probably doesn't mean much, right? But for Iranian tradition, is a loaded culture, it has loaded cultural value, can certainly be there. It's still Iranian, but it's okay to both sides. Yes, Professor Schwartz.
I was exceedingly struck, I think, anyone who's immersed in this history is struck by that substitution of Sibor for the fire altar. You showed a textile with a Seymour. What is the convenience of that textile?
I have no idea. I've just taken that. The closest thing I can think of that is Prince of Persia. If you look closely at the film, there's a part that has these banners, and the banner of Seymour is exactly played right there in green. I was like, oh my God. That's why I've just took it from the internet. So I don't know if it's a textile from Egypt or if it's probably not Egyptian. But so
an art historian who's presently living in Berkeley, Carol Beer, has done some very interesting research on Seymour, and there may be a missing link here for her, and I think you should.
I would be glad to.
You should get in touch with each other.
Absolutely.
Very.
I don't know if I understood right. You referenced something to Shiaism, and the date was like 692 or 695 or something like that. Mm-hmm. And what I've heard, Shia was really started during Safavid. Did it exist at that
680,
time?
what has happened in 680 CE? Imam Hussein, it's Karbala.
Yeah, but
Shias, that has already, I mean, these events resonate and has made, real impact in the Middle East, in Iraq. I mean, in Kufa, and around it, it's already, you have factions who are pro-Ali, the faction of Ali. Now, what we call as sort of church Shiism, or, what we call as institutional Shiism, the Safavids make it current in Iran as the official state religion. But certainly there are Shiite elements and family ruling dynasties in Iran already in the 8th century.
Named Shia?
Well, we call them Shia. They're the various type of Shias. All the way up north in Caspian, Zaydis. Zaydis are up there as it is the Ziyarids. They're up there operating in Yemen and in the Caspian Sea, by the Caspian Sea. There are certainly Shias in Iraq. That is their center of power. Ali and, why is the battle taking place in Kaaba? Because Ali and, Hussein, that is their power base, as opposed to the Umayyads who are in Syria. And what I'm saying is interesting that these local Iranians are making alliances with the Umayyads there.
Yeah.
Right? They're not doing so. Something else of interest, that I should state. Please, and then please. Yes, I don't know what this is.
I'm aware that you may be asking a very uneducated question in your field, but nevertheless, taking modern theories of the formation of the cultural self and postmodern theories of cultural theories, things like that, what was the interaction between, let's say, the local Iranian mentality, and if there is even the possibility to say that there was such a thing, taking all the diversities of different areas, and the incoming Arabic influence, because I see these are like two very different ethnos, types of ethos. One is nomadic and conquering, and the other one is sedimented. And then the question which is coming second to that will be, is there a possibility that the Iranian influence can be counted in the history of Islam itself and separation of Sunnah and Shia trends?
Let me answer the second question. That was the traditional explanation in the 19th and perhaps early 20th century. Shia is Iranian and Sunni is non-Iranian. But that's really
Iranian
not.
in what sense?
It's not. It's not. I'm saying that's not really the case. This is the post-Safavid that we get that sort of a viewpoint. Iranians were dominantly Sunni until the coming of, at least if we don't have rough, exact numbers, but dominantly Sunni until the Safavid period. It's on the Safavid period that we get this change. Your first question, in terms of the interaction, what I try to show is that you have the leaders of these cities, either priests or generals or the mayors want, deal in one way with the conquerors. Submit, pay, jizya, convert, or fight and die and get. That's the three type of general encounters that you get with them. Now, go ahead. Did I answer your question?
Is there such a thing as polity self, as a configuration, as a psychological configuration in comparison, and can it be compared in general with the self which is coming in with the Arabic conquest? And if you completely dismiss this question, I will be
No, I won't. I think it depends what sources you look. If you look at Zoroastrian sources in Middle Persia, there's certainly this idea of self and the other. That dichotomy is clear. It's just really sort of the boundary is clear. Now, does that mean that's exactly what played out? We can never tell. We're making assumptions. We need hard evidence. And one text here saying one thing and one text saying that doesn't really tell us everything. It's not that clear. Sorry, sir, and then I have to go here. Yes?
I was going to say, what do you think the Safavids did? I mean, why did they choose to become Shiites?
I'm not a Safavid expert. I leave that to the Safavid experts. But I think in the 13th, 14th century, you have a rise of militant Sufism from North Africa all the way to the Iranian plateau. And what you're getting is you get militancy of Sufi orders, where the Safavids, I think, has also attached itself to it. We made it one of the dominant groups in there. But that's all I'm going to say, because I shouldn't really say more than I know. Final, please, yes.
Well, I have two questions. One is that, do we have any literature on what the people, the common people, or the commoners are feeling or talking about at the time of the conquest?
No, because...
Who are they siding with, if at all?
No, what we're getting are texts from the Muslims, these Futuh literature that said we came and conquered. Then you have Zoroastrian texts written a bit after the conquest that these people have come from hell, they look horrible, they want to, they bury their dead, they eat their dead, they kill people. The worst thing that has ever happened to Iranshahr, in its history, probably it's the end of the world. Please, the Savior, come and just put an end to this misery. Okay? So you get a religious view of a group that was probably the dominant group of these new conquerors who are now the masters. And then you have the conquerors who are saying, look, the few people we came and killed them. Now, the common people, we don't know. I mean, unless there was Zoroastrian, we would suggest that that is what their viewpoint is. But we really don't know what the common person here did or felt. I gave a talk at UCLA, I think last month, and there was this issue of, I talked about Iranshahr, this idea of Iran and an identity that I think comes about with the Sassanians and goes all the way through until the 12th century. It's really there. They said, what about the common person? Well, when we look at, we were talking about Roman history and so on, as my colleague said, we look at the elite. These are the people who leave us writing. Okay, it's not the common people. Now, of course, we do have letters of mostly economic transactions, and I think the largest group is now at Berkeley in the Bancroft Library. How many are they, Professor? I forgot, about 240?
No, close to 300.
300 documents. These were letters sealed and signed that have come to light, that Berkeley has it, from about late Sasanian to early Islam, right, 600 to 800. That tells you, oh, please, Morwai, go buy some oil, get this jug of oil and give it to so and so. I'm worried about you. Write back to me what's going on. So also this idea of a Dogan Sukut, 2 centuries of silence that Iranians didn't write, is completely false. We have Pahlavi documents all the way to the 8th century. Also, they're selling wine and exchanging wine. So we know Islamic law did not apply in the 7th century to the Iranians, at least from this place, which seems to have been, according to Jinus Surah Nabad, that is Qom, what is modern Qom, where there were all these wineries that people were selling wine. It didn't actually apply there in the 7th and 8th century. So then Muslims didn't come with doors and say, okay, no drinking. That is not what seems to have happened. Okay. Please. Somebody have a question here? Please, sir. And we'll go back. Yes,
in regard to Shiism and Sunnism, I heard a version of this having to do with the fact that Iranians couldn't just subscribe to the caliph being the ruler, because they highly valued this blood linkage as far as the kings were concerned. So they went ahead and said, okay, the Prophet Ali was his first cousin, his blood was in his veins, and so on and so forth with his children. And that's why the Shiism really had its foundation early on, because even though you said most of the Iranians were Sunnis prior to the Safavid dynasty. So I don't know if
That's a nice version that we also in Iran have grown up with as a tradition. But if we look at, I think, early sources, there's nothing there that tell us that the Iranians in mass or in general have that type of interest in this sense. Okay, sir.
Yeah, question about the coins. I mean, I got a kind of briefly what I saw from the coins you showed. Most of them were just only either in the Arabic script or in the Pahlavi script. I mean, have you seen mix of those things?
No. What you get, Arab names written in Pahlavi. The intermediate period is there. So before Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, Ubaidullah, I forgot his last name, Khurasan, his name is in Pahlavi. A lot of these people are writing Arabic names in Pahlavi.
So any coin is either fully in Arabic or fully in Pahlavi?
That's right, there's nothing in between. Sir?
Question about the famous story about the wife of Imam Hussein is considered the princess of Iran, the daughter of Yazid. Is it true or is it just...
Allahu Alam.
about that or something?
I should say again Allahu Alam, but I should also say that about 5 years ago, no, about 10 years ago, the most interesting manuscript was found, I think, in Astan Quds al-Azali, a text called Ali Nameh. This is a Shiite epic about Ali and his family, written in Persian about 20 to 40 years after the Shahnameh, which in fact is a dialogue or sort of interacting with the Shahnameh. At the end saying that, look, this Shahnameh thing is just story and fables of these people. If you really want real stories, you have to come to the Epic of Ali, which has this tradition. So the earliest one is at least 40 years in Persian after the Shahnameh. So it's 11th century. That has just been published. I've seen the manuscript being published, and I think it is in work to have the edited volume, which has all sorts of interesting Irano-Shiite tradition, including that one, which became a popular story where everyone was saying, well, this is a later tradition, and written about. Mary Boyce, I think, has written something about Bibi Shahbanu and these ideas as well, but we now even see it all the way in the 11th century as a textual Persian tradition as well. But again, as I would say, Allahu Alam. I have no idea. Sir and sir.
You touched just a little bit on, the modern nationalist paradigm when we look at these conflicts as something as, Iranian culture, Arab culture, have been historically coming into contact and fighting, and, it was this geographic context. But at the time of these conquests, was that kind of ideology existing among the people where, it was defense of everything that is Iranian versus, this scary Arab culture, or was it just a question of warfare, geographic,
Well, it depends what source and what period you're looking at. Zoroastrian texts are really clear about this. Arabs are bad because they've come and conquered. They've taken what belongs here. There are Iranian values that they are defining. Okay, so that is clear in terms of what you see in 8th, 9th, 10th century Zoroastrian Middle Persian texts. You can't get away from it. Okay, so there's that. Now, Arabs and Iranians being in contact, they have been in contact much longer than that. Much, much longer than that. Sassanians, in fact, the first people to settle Arab tribes in the Iranian plateau are not after the conquest, but during the Sassanian period. If you just simply pick up Tabari, it says during the time of Shapur II, when he goes on a rampage and destroys, the south of the Persian Gulf, and kills a lot of the Arabs when he takes the title, he's given the title of Dolaktaf, right, the piercer of shoulder. What is that? He's killed a lot of Arabs, and then the typical Near Eastern idea of displacing tribes and people. In Kerman, further up north, and in Fars, wholesale Arab tribes are settled. So Arabs are in Iran. It's not that there is this, complete demarcation. Now what happens is there were walls built on the sides of this Sassanian Empire to keep nomadic forces coming in, be it Arab nomads, be it, nomadic forces in the northeast, or the ones coming from the Caucasus. So it's not Arab, but it's about, I think, people who are nomads and how to deal with nomads. Either you settle them or you fight them. Sir?
I have a
comment.
I have a comment and one question. The comment is regarding whether the Iranians embraced the Muslim invasion, which, like you say, we don't know. It's not documented what the commoners thought about it. But I think of like the U.S. invasion of Iraq, where Saddam Hussein wasn't exactly a very popular leader. You know, he killed lots of people. So your common Iraqi probably didn't like Saddam Hussein. Nonetheless, they didn't really want a foreign government occupying their land and their homeland. So in that sense, I think, so my comment is that logic tells me that it cannot be that the majority of the Iranians, openly embrace these invaders. And my question is, how about the culture of people during that era, that end of the era of the Sasanians? Like, for example, did they have slavery in Iran at that time?
Okay.
They had it later, but they had
the way you're going, I mean, I could pick your ideological sort of thing, but the idea of slavery, certainly in Mesopotamia, we have legal texts that people could own slaves. You had Bandeg Shahri, Iranian slave, and you had Bandeg Anshahri, non-Iranian slaves. That is clear from Madigan Hezar Dadistan, for example, 7th century minutes or proceedings of legal cases. Certainly there was slavery. Slavery was quite common in Eurasia. It's nothing outstanding to pick out about the Iranians, to say because they had slavery. No, the Iranians had it, the Romans had it, the Chinese had it. Everyone had slavery. That was a common idea. So this idea of bringing freedom to slaves as sort of these, freedom projects, that was not really part of this mentality of late antique world. Okay. Let me go this way, sir. And yes.
Lack of literature from pre-Islamic era is often blamed on Arabs during libraries and all of things. What's your idea about it?
My idea? Okay. Not that it's the last word there. I think, first of all, I'm now more and more pushing with Professor Ravana. I've been talking and tomorrow. We have a number of Pahlavi texts, some fragments of a few page or half a page, to really major texts, probably 200 or even more. We don't even know on the number of Pahlavi texts we have. After 100 years of research in Middle Persian, we don't still know the name of every text that exists. So, but then we say there's nothing there. So first let's see what's there, and then see what's not there. Now, that is just one aspect. That's my sort of horn that I'm tooting. The other idea is, look, there were various types of literature there, right? What seems to have been of interest to the Muslims, how the king ate, what they did, how to rule the country, cultural texts and so on, were probably translated in Beit al-Hikmah during the Abbasid period, right? This great translation movement. And Dimitri Gutas and others have written on this. And what they're doing is making Khosrow the First court ready. They also were translating texts from Syriac and Greek into Persian, and the Abbasids are actually copying that tradition. So the texts that were important were translated into Arabic, and some of them later into Persian. Religious text remains with the Zoroastrians, right? They keep the texts that are important in terms of, so they can't keep up everything, right? Cultural texts, there are very few of them because there's of no use, most of them have been translated. And those that are not use of either religious circle or these fall into disuse and you leave. Arabic becomes, by the 8th century, the important language. That's the language you need to keep things. What's the use of having Pahlavi texts on how to, govern in the 11th century? But no one can read it, but there has been this language shift and change. And some of that gets used. Now, there's also destruction. We know, for example, when the Muslims came to Ctesiphon, apparently the archive did caught fire and was destroyed. In East, they were forced actually burning of books further to the northeast, great and fast. So it depends on the situation and I think the type of text. Sir, please.
So as you said that the Arabs before attacking Iran, they proposed to the Persian Empire to either become Muslim?
No, during that fighting. So you go to the city of, Ardabil. You say, you have choice. You meet the local ruler out there. You want to fight? Okay. But, you're going to get killed, slavery, and you have to pay double. Or you pay tribute, we'll let you have your religion, that's fine, just give us tribute. Or just become Muslim and, you're part of the army.
Okay, so can we say that they had more economical intentions behind attacking the other cities, rather than just making other people Muslim and converting them?
Well, that depends on your text. Certainly, economic interest is very much important. I think Dr. Prushayati has also emphasized that. That's it's economic interest, of course, that here is at play as well with the Arabs and these people. That's certainly viable. Sir?
I was interested to know how much conquering Iran affected Arabs, like even because I think Iran has this quality that sort of observes the people who come across it into its culture, like with Mongols, different Turkish tribes, even Greeks to a certain extent. Have you come across any information on how it affected not just Arabs that came to Iran, but Arabs in mainland, in Arabian Peninsula, and how it affected their culture, how it affected their way of living?
I think once the Arabs, of course, settle in Iran, what happens? The end result is they become Persianized or Iranianized. I mean, Persian is a language that survives in other languages. Arabic becomes a language of science and everybody knows. That is the important language of knowledge. But Persians does survive, and that suggests that these people who come, they settle and they become part of this culture. And I think that what you say as an Iranian, I can put my nationalist bit, is the beauty of this is that you absorb the conquerors, the people who migrate. I detest this idea of purity. That we have this original Aryan blood in all of our DNA, and somehow these others have come. These are just fabrications of, in 18th and 19th century, with all due respect, European sort of, romantic views. That got translated, which I don't want to get into, with people, Mirza Ohani Kermani and Talibov, and Salah al-Noman and things like that, and that became current, unfortunately, among some of our people. Which has never been the case. Iran has always been a mixed bag, if whatever you call Iran. This Iran has been mixed ideas and mixed bag. Okay, sir.
I was going to say, based on the numbers of Arabs and the vast, area of Iranshahr, it wouldn't make any sense for them to, be able to completely control the whole area physically. But they could maybe, move into certain areas and then pull back and then leave their leaders and have their leaders try to, build a society. And that's probably where you have all the mixing of coinages and slows the constant revolutions, revolts. I mean, it seems like there's a lot of mixing because it's such a vast area.
Sure. Sassanians are an urban society, and they're created really on the force of creating cities, and they do a number of them. If you always fly over Iran, you'll see that it's to a large extent it's barren. Not that it's always like that. It's these cities that are important. Remember, how many major cities do you have? How many of these cities can you control to say you control Iranshahr? Of course, you're not controlling every village and everything. You control the major cities, right? You control Iran. Okay? So I think that's the short answer to the long one. Sir in the back, and then I'm going to come down and go here, and then I'll stop with you. Yes?
So, about this kind of re-emergence of kingship in Iran, what was the extent of the rule, and why is this in Jordan?
Because Umayyads are centered in Syria and what we call sort of modern-day Jordan, and Qusayr al-Amra. You have this wonderful. This is sort of more of a propaganda piece. So you have these 6 kings or rulers who are submitting to the Umayyad rulers. In a way, the Umayyads are trying to portray themselves as continuation of this tradition, and of course Yazd or Khosrow, whoever that is one of that. So you still find that under the Umayyads, you have sort of a nice Hellenic and Iranian tradition surviving. I want you to get out of this mentality, not you per se, but in general. The Arabs come, devout Muslims, destroy everything else, they're just praying all the time and they don't care about anything. That is not the reality of what we're saying here that is going on. Okay? It's much more complex, depends on who you're talking about. The Khawarij, if you're talking about the Khawarij, they're very different in how they deal, not only with non-Muslims, but also Muslims in early Islam, right? But the Umayyads are not, this is part of this imperial sort of.
What was the extent of like the Iranian kingship, just because you mentioned?
Well, I mean, we see that it influences certainly probably until, Syria and so on. It did have an influence, although the Romans also had an influence there as well. Sir? No questions here? Okay. Sir? And then
my question goes back to the archaeology side of your research. Your research is mostly based on the coinage, as you mentioned.
That was when I was much younger.
Yeah. I want to see how certain are you or general scientists are about the age of the coins.
Oh, the coinage actually have dates on it.
Oh, very good.
So much better than text, I would say. Probably most texts. Not all texts, I would say most texts. Anything else? If you want to know, I have a couple of books there. You could see actually, so they're giving some detail on the Conquest of the Black One. This is the same one. Okay, should I start? Or did you have?